Now, our next speaker has invaluable information to share with you regarding FTD genetics and genetic testing. Emily Dwosh, who's worked at the University of British Columbia Hospital Clinic for Alzheimer's disease and related disorders since 2001, has been providing clinical genetic counseling services to individuals and their family members who are adjusting to new diagnoses of Alzheimer's, FTD, and other neurological disorders. She provides genetic counseling support to members of more than 70 families with familial FTD who attend UBC each year as research participants. Emily is a co-investigator with the UBC Clinical, Pathological, Genetic, and Biomarker Studies of FTD, and she has co-authored several peer-reviewed journal articles pertaining to FTD, to familial Alzheimer's disease, and to multiple sclerosis. Emily, we're thrilled to have you join us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Good morning. It's morning here. I'm also on the West Coast. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of today's event. And indeed, we'll be talking today about genetics and genetic counseling. So I'll just switch over to my presentation. So to start out, just a quick overview of the plan for the next 20 minutes. So it sounds like Dr. Boxer has gone into quite a bit about some of the specific genes that can play a role in FTD onset, but we're going to back up and provide a more of an overview of the role of genetics in FTD. We'll talk about genetic testing options and possible test outcomes, some things to consider before genetic testing, and an exploration of the role of genetic counseling for frontotemporal dementia. So when we look at the entire patient population of people with FTD, we can divide that patient group from a genetics perspective into two subgroups. One group we call sporadic FTD, which makes up about 60% of the patient population, and then the remaining 40% we describe as having familial FTD. Sporadic FTD is something that every one of us may develop as we live our lives. It is something that can happen to anyone. It typically is something we would consider not to run in a family, and the underlying cause of sporadic FTD remains a mystery in many ways. We understand that the cause is likely to be complex and multifactorial, meaning it's not going to be just one single factor that is causing the condition to onset, but a combination of many factors, including a role for the aging process, lifestyle and environmental factors, and some genetic susceptibility factors, which would be genes that don't directly cause FTD on their own, but play a role in how predisposed a person might be to develop sporadic FTD in their lifetime. The familial form of FTD is something that we would describe as being purely genetic. So familial cases of FTD are caused by mutations or spelling mistakes in single specific genes. And if a person has one of these genes with one of those spelling mistakes, they will, with almost complete certainty, develop FTD in their lifetime. And then that specific gene change can be directly passed on from an affected parent to each of their children, with a likelihood of 50%. So why is it a 50% likelihood of that gene being passed on? That stems from our very clear understanding of how our genes get passed on when we have our kids. And also recognizing that when we think about each of our genes, we all have two copies of each gene, one that we get from our mother and one that we get from our father. So if an individual has familial FTD because of a specific gene change, they would only have that gene change in one copy of that particular gene, and their second copy would be expected to be perfectly fine. So when that person goes on to have each of their children, there's just as much chance that they would pass on the copy of that gene that's working perfectly fine, and an equal chance that they might pass on that copy of the gene that has the mutation in it. There have been several genes identified so far that we describe as being causative familial FTD genes, and you've heard of several of these from Dr. Boxer in his previous talk. The more common genetic forms of familial FTD are due to mutations in 3 specific genes: MAPT, progranulin, and then that C9orf72 gene. But there have been about 10 other more rare familial FTD genes discovered over the last decade or so, and I've listed a few of those here. What's important to recognize is that mutations in these known familial FTD genes don't explain all cases of familial FTD, and it's understood that there are probably going to be other familial FTD genes discovered in the years to come. What do we know about these familial FTD genes so far? We know that many of them work in quite mysterious ways. We know that several of them demonstrate what's called in the genetics world variable expression. So that's a term that describes when the same gene, when the same spelling mistake or mutation in the same gene can lead to different symptoms in different people. So, for example, if a person has a mutation in their C9 gene, they may end up with frontotemporal dementia, but they could also end up with symptoms of ALS or with a combination of both. And we also see variable expression in progranulin and MAPT gene mutations, where individuals may present with frontotemporal dementia, but some patients may actually also present with Parkinsonism. We recognize that individuals who have mutations in these genes can have a wide variety of ages of onset, symptoms, and progression of their disease. It's different for each person, and we can't really predict what each individual may experience. Another thing that we see in these familial FTD genes is a concept that's called, again, in the genetics world, reduced penetrance. So that's a term that describes when a gene mutation may not always lead to the onset of symptoms that we typically associate with that gene change. So a person might have a particular gene change, but live their whole life and never develop the symptoms of the particular disease that that gene is known for. So for example, we know that mutations in the C9 and progranulin gene demonstrate about 90% penetrance by age 70. So that means if you looked at a whole bunch of people with C9 and progranulin mutations, at age 70, about 10% of them won't have any neurological symptoms that we associate with those gene changes. They may develop their symptoms after 70, and there's actually some people out there who may never develop symptoms at all, and they may pass away due to something else before they develop FTD or ALS or Parkinsonism. So the big question that genetic counselors would receive when meeting with families who are worried about a family history of FTD is, how do we know if the condition is sporadic or familial? How can we tell? And, is there something in a person's symptomology? Is there a specific autopsy finding? And these are really tricky questions. So are there specific FTD symptoms that would tell us that this is more likely sporadic or familial? Well, yes. In some cases, we know that there are some clinical presentations of FTD that are more often seen in sporadic cases, but there are always exceptions, and it's really not sort of solid enough evidence that we would say that clinical presentation means we know for sure that it must be sporadic. And then with regards to specific autopsy findings, yes, there are some very specific autopsy findings that are only seen in familial cases, but most of the time, the autopsy findings of FTD can be seen in both the familial and sporadic forms. So the symptoms don't guide us concretely. Autopsy findings usually don't guide us concretely. So we really rely quite a bit still on what the family history may tell us. So these are the things that we look for in the family tree. So in a family with what we would expect to be sporadic FTD, we would look for a family tree like this one, where there's just one person with frontotemporal dementia. There's no other family history of that condition or related neurological diseases like ALS or Parkinsonism reported. It's always reassuring to see relatives that have passed away at older ages with no neurological symptoms. And in this scenario, we would probably be able to be reassuring to this family that this looks more like the hallmarks of a sporadic case of FTD. In families with familial FTD, we would be more likely to see a family like this one. We would be looking for a family history where there's multiple people with frontotemporal dementia or related conditions. So family members may report cases of dementia or even Alzheimer's disease. You know, the terminology may not be specific, but we're just sort of looking for that overall picture of a family history of many people over many generations affected with sort of these clusters of related neurological disease. And this would be a family that we would be quite suspicious represents a familial case of FTD. Family histories can tell us quite a bit, but again, this is not a perfect science. And family histories also have to be interpreted with quite a bit of caution. And thinking back to some of that terminology that we went over regarding variable expression, reduced penetrance, what that can mean is that a family history may not appear, may not sort of reveal the true scenario. You might have a family where there's no other cases of FTD or related conditions, but perhaps that's because the parental or grandparental generation, maybe those individuals carried a gene change, but were demonstrating reduced penetrance or passed away before their symptoms began. And some recent studies suggest that there are actually familial FTD gene mutations found in a small portion, but an existing portion of what looks like apparently sporadic FTD cases. So if families are concerned about the possibility that their condition is genetic, clinical genetic testing for familial FTD is an option. Testing ideally starts with an affected individual, so somebody who has a diagnosis of FTD or one of those related conditions, and we would describe this as diagnostic genetic testing, that testing in an affected person. The testing is available at several commercial laboratories, and the costs vary. This is testing that must be physician ordered. These tests are not available through direct-to-consumer companies such as 23andMe. So what would the possible outcomes be of a diagnostic genetic test? It would be possible that the testing would reveal no mutations in the genes that are analyzed. If a person receives a negative genetic test result, that might provide some additional reassurance that the FTD in that individual is indeed sporadic. But there's that caveat that the negative genetic test doesn't rule out the possibility that that person has familial FTD caused by a mutation in a gene that has yet to be discovered. And we really do sort of stress that caveat when we see families that are very striking with many people affected over many generations. If in a family like that, the genetic testing comes back negative, we do stress to families that the family history is so suggestive of something genetic that maybe it's just due to some other gene that wasn't analyzed. Additional testing may be available in the future as new genes are discovered. And in our center, we do talk about the option of DNA banking to give families options for testing down the road. If a positive test result is identified, that means that they did find a specific gene mutation. That would confirm that the individual has familial FTD. It would confirm that 50% recurrence risk for their offspring and their siblings. And then the family members of that person would have the option of predictive genetic testing, which is testing of individuals who have no symptoms. Prior to predictive genetic testing, most centers require genetic counseling in advance of the testing. And I'm a real advocate of genetic counseling prior to any genetic testing, even when it's diagnostic. The genetic counseling process allows families to have opportunities for education and support, a thorough review of the testing options and possible outcomes, and it really, really encourages this concept of informed decision making so that people really know what to expect going into the test and are prepared for what the outcomes may be. If after genetic counseling an individual decides to proceed with predictive genetic testing, what would the outcomes be of that sort of test? Well, in those scenarios, if a person tests positive, we would know that they are most likely to develop FTD or a related condition at some point in their life, but we would not be able to predict their specific symptoms or age of onset due to those concepts of variable expression and reduced penetrance. And for that person who tested positive via predictive testing, we would now know that their own children have a 50% likelihood of carrying that same gene change. If a person has predictive testing and they receive a negative genetic test result, we could reassure them that they are no longer at risk for familial FTD, and neither are their own children. If you don't inherit a gene, you can't pass it on. The decision to have genetic testing can be a difficult one. It's a very personal choice, and attitudes and opinions vary even within families. The genetic counseling process is non-directive, and it really ensures that patients and families make choices about testing that are right for them. Some general considerations that would be discussed in a genetic counseling session would be things like, why are you interested in having this test? What's motivating you to have this test? And what's motivating you to have this test now? Could there be insurance implications for you or your family members? What would the impact of testing and the test results be on your relationships with family and your own psychological well-being? Will the test results alter your medical management? And for example, could these test results provide you with eligibility for gene-specific clinical trials? So this last point is going to, I think, change quite a bit of the conversation around genetic testing, and we're going to have to see what transpires in the next few years as these clinical trials develop. So how do you access genetic counseling services? You can talk to your family doctor or specialist about services in your community. And I would say even just do a Google search to see if you can locate genetic counseling services in your area. Genetic counseling during COVID has carried on at our center. We've moved everything to video conference and telehealth. I've found it actually to be quite a bonus now that we're very comfortable with telehealth and video conferencing. We've been able to arrange family sessions with multiple relatives all across the country at the same time, which has been very advantageous. And the genetic testing itself, we've been able to facilitate. Patients don't need to even go to a blood lab because many of the genetic testing companies use saliva kits for DNA collection now. So to conclude, most FTD is sporadic and multifactorial. About 40% of cases are familial and purely genetic. Genetic testing for familial FTD is available and a relevant option for many FTD patients, and genetic counseling can help you understand the impact of your family history of FTD as well as your genetic testing options. And I welcome your questions. Thank you very much.
Emily, that was terrific. Thank you so much. And the questions are indeed rolling in. One, is there a link between the C9orf72 and VCP gene mutations, as both of them have phenotypes of FTD and ALS?
Sorry, Susan, can you repeat the question? I was just toggling back with my screen.
Sure, that's okay. The question is if there's a link between C9 and VCP mutations, since this person says both of them can produce FTD and or ALS.
So that's a great question. There's actually, among that list of genes that we know can cause familial FTD, there are actually a handful of them, including VCP, but also TBK1, TIA1, that are known to cause both FTD and or ALS. The connection between FTD and ALS has to do with the specific protein that builds up in the brain cells in both of those conditions. So both FTD and ALS are caused by the accumulation of proteins in the brain cells. And the majority of ALS patients, the name of the protein that's building up in their brain cells is called TDP-43. And we know that that exact same protein is what's building up in the brain cells of about half of all FTD patients. And when that protein was identified and it was recognized that we see that protein in most ALS cases and about half of FTD cases, that really solidified that FTD and ALS are connected in this way. And then since that protein discovery, these genes that have been discovered that can lead to either and or FTD or ALS has even further solidified that there is an association between the sort of the disease process of those conditions.
Great, thank you. Something of a similar question is, can MS be related to genetic FTD?
So MS, it would be considered a different condition than FTD. MS is an autoimmune disease. It's not caused by abnormal proteins building up in the brain cells. It's caused when the body has an immune response to its own nervous system. So in terms of sort of the disease mechanism, MS and FTD are considered separate conditions. However, we know that the symptoms of MS are very broad and can impact people in a bunch of different ways. And so as a genetic counselor taking the family history of somebody with frontotemporal dementia, if they report a family history of MS, especially if it was in a previous generation or maybe a distant relative that they don't know so well, it does for me, whenever I can, I would try to get medical records about that person because the symptoms of MS actually can be mimicked by ALS and FTD. So there's overlap between the symptomology of all of those conditions. And so if someone got a clinical diagnosis of MS and they never had an autopsy to confirm it, or we just don't know too much about them, I would wonder, could that have been a case of FTD or ALS, but it was misdiagnosed, or maybe the family talked about it in a different way?
As you said, that kind of complicates reading a family history as you talk about.
Exactly.
Yeah. This person wants to know if there's any support during genetic counseling for the emotional aspect of going through testing, or is it more just based on making sure the decision is right and the implications are understood?
There's definitely an aspect of emotional support. That's actually one of the key purposes of the genetic counseling process, is recognizing the need for that emotional support and to provide individuals and family members with that emotional support as they're figuring out what the best decision is for them.
Is there a particular type of genetic counselor you should look for to learn about your FTD risk?
I guess in an ideal world, if you are able to access genetic counseling services in a setting that is very familiar with neurological conditions, those genetic counselors would likely have
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
with predictive testing and the specific nuances of what exactly families are going through when they're making those decisions. But the training of genetic counselors is very standardized, and even a genetic counselor who's never seen a family with frontotemporal dementia before would be well trained and very capable of providing the support that's needed.
Great, good. I think you touched on this earlier, but the question, it's an important one. Does your family member who's affected with FTD need to be genetically tested before other family members can be tested?
Yes, in an ideal world, we would always want to start the testing process with the person in the family who has a diagnosis. And that's because that makes any further testing of other family members as informative as possible. So I always ask families to sort of walk through scenarios to understand why we need to start with that affected person. If we don't start with the affected person and we start with an unaffected family member, and that unaffected family member's test results come back negative, meaning no mutation was found, we won't know what that actually means for that person. It could be that they tested negative because their parent had a mutation and did not pass it on. But it could also mean that that person tested negative because if we had tested their parent, the parent also would have been negative because there's not an identifiable gene mutation explaining the FTD in the family. So if we start with the affected parent, and we find a mutation in that affected parent or sibling, we know concretely that the explanation for their condition is that specific gene mutation. And then any testing of relatives provides very clear answers. You either got that disease-causing mutation or you didn't, as opposed to starting with that unaffected, which muddies the waters.
Got it. Thank you. And maybe one final question. About how long does genetic testing, should it take to get results if you do have a genetic test?
The turnaround time from the labs, like from the moment that they receive your sample to when you get results, that's usually relatively quick, between, depending on the lab, 2 weeks to 6 weeks for most of those labs that I put on the slide. Usually what takes the longest is getting the access to the pre-test genetic counseling. So getting the referral from the GP, being on a bit of a wait list before you see the genetic counselor, getting the blood draw coordinated. Those are the things that usually take a little bit more time. Once all that is sorted out, the time from the lab is usually quite quick.